Have you ever wondered if that strange, confusing, or seemingly meaningless dream could be more than just random images in your mind? What if, deep down, this dream was a message, something much bigger than it seems? Maybe you woke up from a dream with your heart racing, feeling like there was something more there, something hidden in the shadows of the unseen. If you've been there, what you're about to hear is no ordinary story. And no, you didn't get here by chance. Our protagonist's experience carries powerful meaning, and perhaps you too will begin to see your dreams with different eyes after this. Pay close attention, because this story reveals important signs that may be the key to understanding how God is trying to communicate with you. Yes, even through those dreams that seem to make no sense. The story begins in a small village at the foot of the mountains of Judah, where a young man named Lemuel lived. He was not a prophet. He was not the son of priests, nor was he known for great wisdom or exploits. He was a simple farmer, like many in his village, dedicating his days to the land and his family's animals. But there was something about him that few noticed. From a young age, Lemuel was a dreamer, and not just in the sense of having ambitions and aspirations, but because he literally dreamed every night. His nights were filled with strange and, most of the time, incomprehensible dreams. He often wondered about the meaning of those confusing images, until one night, he had a dream that was different from all the others. He found himself walking through an endless desert. The sun burned his skin, and in the distance, he could see a river. It looked like an oasis lost in the middle of so much sand. As he got closer, he noticed something surreal. What was flowing in the river was not water, but liquid gold, shiny and intense. When Lemuel tried to touch the gold, the river disappeared, leaving him alone in the vast desert. Lemuel woke up scared, covered in sweat. What could that dream mean? Why did he dream of gold in the desert? Trying to shake off these questions, he decided to ignore it, believing it was just another strange and meaningless image that his mind had created. But the dreams continued. They weren't always the same, but there was always something unusual, something he couldn't understand. Little by little, Lemuel began to feel that there was something deeper behind these images, but he didn't know who to turn to. The elders of his village always said that dreams were nothing more than reflections of daily thoughts, and there were none there. Still, Lemuel couldn't shake the feeling that his dreams were important, as if God were trying to tell him something. Determined to find answers, he remembered Aton, a wise elder who lived in a neighboring village, known for his deep relationship with God. At dawn, Lemuel set out in search of Aton, hoping to finally understand the meaning of his dreams. Lemuel followed his path to the neighboring village, where old Aton lived. As he walked, anxiety grew in his chest. At every step, the young farmer wondered if it was really worth bothering the wise man because of his dreams. Maybe Aton would laugh at him, or worse, say it was all a figment of his imagination. But something inside Lemuel drove him forward. It was as if his own dreams were calling him. Upon arriving at Aton's house, a small stone hut at the top of a hill, Lemuel approached it hesitantly. The door was ajar, and inside, the wise old man was sitting at the table, his eyes fixed on an ancient book. Before Lemuel could knock, Aton raised his head and, with an enigmatic smile, said, "I was already waiting for you." Lemuel was surprised, but at the same time, something in the old man's eyes calmed him. It was as if Aton already knew the reason for his visit before he even opened his mouth. "Your dreams, Lemuel, they brought you here, didn't they?" asked Aton, while gesturing for the young man to sit. Lemuel, still disconcerted, nodded and began to tell about the dream of the river of gold in the desert, his restless nights, and the feeling that there was something important hidden in those images. Aton listened in silence, his eyes closed as if he was meditating on each word. "Not all dreams are divine messages, Lemuel, but some are. The problem is that we often don't know how to interpret them," said the old man after a long silence. "The dream of gold in the desert. There is something more there. God speaks to men in ways that we do not always understand immediately." Lemuel frowned. "What does it mean then, Aton? What does God want from me?" Aton slowly got up and walked over to a bookshelf full of dusty parchments and books. He pulled out an ancient parchment, his callous fingers handling the material delicately. Unrolling it on the table, Aton pointed to a series of symbols engraved there. This is an old text. It talks about God's signs and how he communicates his will. Dreams, visions, signs in nature. All of this is part of what we call revelation. The gold you saw, Lemuel, could represent many things. But I feel like, in your case, it's a promise. The desert is difficulty, emptiness. Gold is the blessing, the purpose that God has in store for you. But to reach it, you will have to cross the desert. Are you willing to do that? Lemuel was silent for a moment. The idea of facing difficulties before achieving blessing frightened him. But at the same time, something inside him knew that this was the answer he was looking for. Yes, I'm willing, he replied with determination. Aton smiled, his eyes shining with a wisdom that Lemuel could not yet fully comprehend. Then get ready, young man. Your journey is just beginning. And remember, God never reveals the entire path all at once. He guides us step by step, dream by dream. With these words echoing in his mind, Lemuel said goodbye to Aton and began his walk back home. Little did he know that that simple encounter was the beginning of a series of events that would change his life forever. In the days following his meeting with Aton, Lemuel couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to take an unexpected turn. Work on the plantations, once a routine that brought a certain comfort, now seemed meaningless. His mind wandered, always returning to the vision of the golden desert and the mysterious destiny that seemed to call him. With each sunset, the dreams returned, clearer and more intense, as if they were trying to guide him to a hidden truth. It was one morning, while working under the hot sun, that a strange presence surprised him. A man, simple in appearance but with an aura of authority, approached silently. His eyes, deep and enigmatic, seemed to peer into Lemuel's soul. There was something about this stranger that made him uneasy, as if he were facing someone who knew more than he let on. Without any immediate explanation, Lemuel felt that this man knew about his dreams. As the stranger approached, the feeling that their fates were connected grew stronger and stronger. The man had an inexplicable calm, but his presence was imposing, like someone who had already faced immense challenges. He seemed to know more about Lemuel's dreams than Lemuel himself could understand, and the simple exchange of glances between the two revealed that this journey would not be faced alone. That unexpected encounter brought to light a truth that Lemuel was still reluctant to accept. Dreams were not just fragments of his imagination, but messages, perhaps even prophecies, meant to guide him on a greater journey. The stranger, named Abner, had traveled the same route in the past, but had never reached his destination. There was something about Abner's story that resonated with Lemuel's own fears and longings. Abner spoke of a wilderness, not just as a physical landscape, but as a place of spiritual and emotional trials. The connection between the two men grew as Abner described his own quest, his failures, and the challenges he faced. Lemuel, previously hesitant, began to realize that this journey was inevitable, that the desert awaited him, not just as an arduous crossing, but as an opportunity for self-discovery. Golden dreams, as Abner suggested, was not just material treasure, but a metaphor for something much deeper. It was an encounter with the truth, with the purpose that each man carried within himself, but that few could see. As the understanding of this journey deepened, so did the fear. The desert now symbolized more than heat and sand. It was a reflection of the insecurities and doubts that lived in Lemuel's heart. Facing the desert meant confronting your own fears, dealing with the unknown, and being prepared for sacrifices that you still couldn't foresee. The promise of gold, which once sounded like a distant reward, now seemed like an invitation to delve into something much greater than simple wealth. Lemuel knew that despite Abner's company, the journey would be lonely in many ways. The desert, as the stranger explained, revealed different truths to each person, challenging them in unique ways. For Lemuel, the biggest challenge would be discovering his true purpose and facing what he feared most. He felt a mix of anxiety and determination rising within him. There was no turning back. That moment was decisive. As the two prepared to leave, Lemuel looked one last time at the familiar landscape of his village. The sound of the birds, the smell of the earth, the warmth of the sun. Everything seemed to belong to a life I was about to leave behind. The desert, distant on the horizon, waited like a sleeping giant, ready to test his strength and his faith. Every step Lemuel would take from then on would be a step into the unknown, the mysterious and the fearsome. Abner would be by his side for a while, but deep down, Lemuel knew that at some point he would have to face this journey alone. And so, with his heart divided between the fear of what was to come and the hope of an uncertain future, Lemuel moved on, leaving behind the life he knew and embracing the call of the desert. Lemuel and Abner set out the next morning, following the trail of the desert that shone in the distance like a golden ocean in the scorching sun. The silence between them was heavy, as if the air around them was charged with an omen they could not yet fully understand. The vastness ahead seemed to swallow up the small trail they were taking, as if the desert itself was waiting patiently for them, aware of what was to come. As they walked, Lemuel felt the weight of each step. It wasn't the intense heat or the physical weight of the journey that tired him, but the growing anxiety that lodged in his chest. The desert had a unique way of amplifying inner fears. The immensity of the sand and the infinite horizon seemed to mirror his doubts, as if each grain of sand was a reminder of the challenges he still needed to face. The sun moved slowly across the sky, making the environment increasingly disorienting, with no clear reference points, just emptiness. Abner walked beside him in silence, his expression closed and introspective. There was something about the way he moved forward that showed he already knew that path, not necessarily the physical path, but the internal challenges that lay ahead. Lemuel realized that although Abner was at his side physically, each was fighting his own battle, and little by little, he began to understand what the other man had meant about the desert, revealing different truths to each person. The first night in the desert came as a blessing and a curse. The stars shone brightly in the sky, offering a cold and lonely beauty. Lemuel laid down on the sand, feeling loneliness take over his mind. The silence was deafening. There was something about the desert at night that made everything clearer and, at the same time, more terrifying. The light wind that blew brought a feeling of helplessness, as if he were truly alone, even with Abner nearby. During the night, the dreams returned with force. Visions of gold, now more vivid, surrounded him. But there was something more. Shadowy figures that danced in the shadows of his memories, as if they were ghosts of past decisions and future fears. Lemuel woke up sweating, his heart racing. The surrounding darkness seemed thicker than ever. The desert was not just a physical landscape. It was a mirror of his own soul, reflecting all his insecurities, magnifying each fear until it was impossible to ignore. Over the next few days, the journey became increasingly challenging. The heat during the day was relentless, and the nights were cold and full of tension. The landscape, which at first seemed monotonous, began to change in subtle ways. The desert seemed to be alive, shaping itself around them, challenging them with sudden winds, treacherous dunes, and a horizon that receded further and further into the distance, like an unattainable goal. Lemuel felt that the desert was testing his resolve, asking him how much he truly wanted what he sought. Abner, who until then had been a constant, comforting presence, began to walk away. His steps became slower, his gaze more distant. Lemuel noticed that the man was fighting something inside himself, something he couldn't share. One morning, when Lemuel woke up, he realized that Abner was no longer by his side. There was only silence, the relentless desert, and the absence of the companion who, until then, had been an anchor in the midst of chaos. Loneliness hit Lemuel hard. The desert, once an external landscape, now became the very reflection of his soul. What he feared most had happened. He was completely alone. From that moment on, there was no one left to share the burden of the journey, no one to offer advice or support. He would have to keep going, facing the desert and whatever was lurking within it. As the days dragged on, Lemuel realized that the journey was not just about reaching a physical destination. The gold of his dreams, which at first seemed to represent material wealth, now began to take another form in his mind. It was a metaphor for something bigger, a truth he needed to discover for himself. Each step into the desert, each sleepless night, each dream vision brought a new fragment of this truth, like pieces of a puzzle that he needed to solve before it was too late. Lemuel's physical resistance began to run out. Their feet were covered in sores. Their lips were chapped from the intense heat and lack of water. But interestingly, the more his body weakened, the more his mind cleared. He began to understand that the true test was not physical, but spiritual. The desert was purifying his thoughts, removing the distractions of everyday life, forcing him to confront his essence. In a moment of extreme exhaustion, Lemuel found himself kneeling in the sand, staring at the distant horizon. The sun was setting, and the sky, painted red and orange, seemed like a living canvas, reflecting his own conflicting emotions. He felt a deep emptiness within him, but also a calm he had never experienced before. It was as if the desert had extracted everything he was, leaving only the raw truth. In that instant, Lemuel understood that the gold he was searching for was not buried beneath the sand or hidden in some remote corner of the desert. The real treasure was the transformation that was taking place within him. The desert, with all its harshness and cruelty, had revealed its essence. He stood up, feeling renewed strength, and knew he was closer to his destination than ever. After days of wandering through the desert, the landscape began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. The terrain, once an endless sea of dunes, now featured rock formations that appeared out of nowhere, like ancient monuments that bore witness to bygone eras. Lemuel observed every detail with tired eyes, but also with a new sense of perception. The desert, which once seemed like an enemy, was now a guide, showing the way through its own metamorphoses. The nights, which previously brought only nightmares, began to bring clearer visions. Now, Lemuel dreamed of crystal-clear waters flowing through rocks and vegetation he had never seen. He knew he was approaching something, as if the desert itself was beginning to grant him access to its deepest secrets. The treasure he pursued, the one that had initially seemed like material gold, now took on a new form in his mind. There was something more than the simple desire for riches. Over time, water and food shortages began to take their toll. Lemuel was exhausted, and every step felt like a monumental struggle. His feet were full of open wounds, his clothes torn from the constant friction with the sand and wind. Thirst was constant, a cruel companion that reminded him at every moment of his fragility. Still, he didn't stop. There was something pushing him forward, an inner force he barely understood. One day, upon reaching the top of a hill, Lemuel saw something in the distance that made him stop. In the middle of the arid desert, a small stone building was embedded at the base of a rock formation, partially covered by sand. He knew he had reached the end of his journey, or at least the culmination of it. Whatever was inside that structure would be what he was looking for. With his heart racing and his breathing irregular, he carefully descended towards the building. The small structure looked like it had been built a long time ago, with stones that had stood the test of centuries. The entrance was narrow, almost imperceptible from a distance, and as he approached, Lemuel felt a strange energy emanating from there. It was as if the air around them was charged with an invisible presence. Entering the building, the temperature changed drastically. The scorching heat of the desert was behind him, and Lemuel found himself enveloped by a cool breeze that seemed to come from deep within the earth. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he noticed that the walls were covered in ancient inscriptions, symbols that he couldn't understand, but that seemed to tell a story. There was an altar in the background, with objects that had clearly been placed there for a sacred purpose. Lemuel approached the altar reverently. He felt that he was facing something ancient and powerful, something that transcended common understanding. His eyes examined the details of the offerings displayed there. Pieces of gold, precious stones, and objects he had never seen before. But Curiously, it wasn't the gold that caught his attention. There was a growing feeling within him, a slow, deep realization that what he sought was not material. At that moment, Lemuel realized that the true treasure was not in the altar or in the riches around him, but in the journey he had taken, the inner transformation he had experienced in the desert, the lessons he learned about himself, his determination and resilience. These were the true treasures. The desert had not taken him there to grant him riches, but to reveal him to himself. When he left the building, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Lemuel felt an inner peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of his old ambitions had been replaced by a new clarity. He knew that, somehow, his life would never be the same. The desert had given him something more valuable than gold. He had been given the gift of self-knowledge, something no one could ever take away from him. Walking back through the desert, Lemuel felt the heat of the sun on his back, but this time he did not see it as a threat. It was just another element in a larger journey. He now understood that the desert was not a place of death, but of rebirth. And although his body was weak, his mind was stronger than ever. He didn't know what the future held, but now he was sure he could face any challenge. As night fell, Lemuel disappeared into the vastness of the desert, a transformed man. The desert had revealed its secrets, and he had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes what we seek outside of us is actually inside all along. As night fell, Lemuel continued his journey through the desert, which now seemed less threatening. The sky was clear, covered in a multitude of stars that illuminated his path. The stars, which had previously seemed distant and unattainable, now accompanied him like silent guides. He walked with slow but steady steps, feeling that each movement was part of a larger cycle. The feeling of completeness, of having found something greater than himself, enveloped him like a cloak. The desert, which once seemed like an enemy, had become a master. Every grain of sand, every gust of wind, every sunset carried a meaning that Lemuel could now understand. He had walked the path that few dared to take, facing his own fears, his weaknesses and ambitions, to discover something that transcends material value. The treasure he sought was not in the precious objects he imagined he would find, but in the inner transformation he had experienced. As the night wore on, Lemuel realized that his journey did not end there. There was something further ahead, a destiny he still didn't fully understand. But instead of feeling the anxiety he had before, he felt peace. The desert had taught him to live in the present, to understand that the true meaning of life was not in the final destination, but in the path taken. The silence around him was comforting. The gentle wind that cut through the desert seemed to whisper ancient secrets, stories that dated back to time immemorial. Lemuel listened attentively, as if he could understand what the wind was saying. He realized that the desert was much more than a hostile environment. It was a place of reflection, a mirror of the soul where those who ventured into it discovered their true motivations and limits. Far from being a simple explorer hunting for riches, Lemuel had become part of that environment. He understood that the desert held many secrets, but they were not for everyone. It took more than physical strength or a desire for gold to earn the respect of this place. It required humility, patience, and the ability to see beyond appearances. Now, he was part of something bigger. The path he had taken through the desert had transformed him into a new person, someone who saw the world differently, without the ties that previously tied him to materiality. He felt the power of internal transformation, the growth that only such a journey could provide. The most important discovery Lemuel made was that the greatest treasure was within himself, hidden behind his worldly ambitions and superficial desires. At dawn, when the first rays of sunlight crossed the horizon, Lemuel raised his eyes to the sky and smiled. He knew he was no longer alone. There was a deep connection between him and the vastness around him, an understanding that everyone was part of something much larger. The desert, with its trials and rewards, had revealed itself as a true master. And so, with a renewed heart and a clear mind, Lemuel continued his journey, without haste, without fear. What once seemed like a barren, lifeless path was now filled with purpose. He knew that no matter what he found in the future, he had already discovered the true treasure, himself.